Good afternoon. Nice to see you all on a cold December day in Minnesota. My name is Ryan Allen. I have the pleasure of serving as the Associate Dean for Research here at the Humphrey School, and I'd like to convene us and get us started on this panel discussion. My own work here at the Humphrey School is in the area of urban and regional planning, but I also focus on immigration, and a variety of other topics. And so this particular panel is of particular importance to me personally, given what I study. Before we begin, let me share some regrets from Dean Nisha Bochwe. She was looking forward to joining us this afternoon, but is taken back to a family emergency, unfortunately, in Atlanta. So she sends her regrets and her best wishes for a productive and engaging conversation for us today. Back in 2016, following a similar pivotal election, we held an event much like this one in this very room. And our goal was to unpack what the results meant for public policy, for our communities, our nation, and in fact, our globe. At that time, it was Dean Eric Schwartz, who sits to my left, who convened us, and I had the opportunity to participate as a panelist during that event. This time, we come together again. It's a different political moment, but it's with the same commitment that we had then, and that is to foster a thoughtful dialogue about the civic and policy implications of our election outcomes. This time, I'm particularly delighted that Eric is here again, now as a professor and a valued part of this group, and it's terrific to have him be a panelist with us here today. The Humphrey School, I should add, is, I think, uniquely positioned to hold such an event and a discussion. Our mission, as you are undoubtedly aware, is to inspire, educate, and engage leaders for the common good. This is rooted in the belief that informed dialogue is the foundation of effective public policy and community resilience. With that in mind, this panel brought together to explore the election's implications across different sectors. We hope this discussion provides clarity. We hope it sparks constructive conversations. We also hope that it helps us think more deeply about the role we can play as individuals and as a collective in navigating this road ahead. I'm grateful to our panelists, and I'll introduce them in just a moment, for sharing their expertise, and to all of you for being a part of this today. Thanks again. So let's dive in. I'm going to do some very short introductions for our panelists and invite them in their prepared remarks to give slightly longer introductions to themselves. To my immediate left, and going from my left to right, going to my left, Eric Schwartz. Eric is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State and current professor here at the Humphrey School. He brings extensive expertise in U.S. foreign policy, international migration, and humanitarian issues. Next to Eric is Professor Christina Ewig. Christina is the director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy here at the Humphrey School. She's a leading scholar in gender equity and social policy, both in the United States and internationally. And finally, Tricia Olson, also a faculty member here at the Humphrey School. Her work bridges business and human rights. Her research delves into how public policies affect human rights and governance on a global scale. Now I want to turn it over to our panelists. What I've asked each panelist to do is to spend about 10 minutes delving into their area of expertise with a specific focus on how they believe the second Trump administration could shape the policies, practices, and outcomes in their respective fields. Colleagues, I'll give you a gentle signal if we're running close to time. Throughout the session, you, the audience, will have an opportunity to submit questions to our panelists. You're going to be using a technology called Slido. How many people have used this before? Excellent. That's many more than me. So what you do here is you'll scan the QR code you see on the screen. This will help get you into the platform. You'll then be able to type out a question and submit it. I'm going to keep track of the questions here on an iPad, and when we come to the Q&A portion of our panel together, that'll be the last half hour. I'm going to be able to curate those questions, and we'll get through as many of them as possible. Right? So, in the interest of getting through as many as possible, if you could be succinct with your questions, that would be really, really very helpful. So let's begin if we can. Professor Schwartz, I'd like for you to take about 10 minutes to talk about the implications of the second Trump administration on issues of national security and migration. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ryan. Can everyone hear me? Good. Well, first, with apologies to my students, all of whom have heard much of this already, I want to thank you for the opportunity to engage in this conversation. But before talking about refugees, humanitarianism, immigration directly, let me set a context. The president-elect, who, when he was president, placed a bust of former President Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office, has been referred to as a national security Jacksonian. But his Jacksonian qualities can be seen in other areas. In particular, in a belief that a popular mandate provides the president with the capacity to disdain or disregard some of the norms and niceties of constitutional democracy. In Jackson's case, that was perhaps most dramatically reflected in the Trail of Tears that resulted in the deaths of thousands of Native Americans, despite an 1832 Supreme Court ruling indicating that Georgia's actions against Native Americans were not permissible. And you can almost hear Donald Trump, and I think if he was sitting here, he would not disagree with this, uttering the kind of, quote, apocryphal or real that has been attributed to Andrew Jackson about Justice John Marshall's 1832 decision in Worcester v. Georgia. And I quote, or maybe I quote, it's debatable whether he said it, John Marshall, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him endorse it. So in foreign policy and national security, and to use, again, Walter Russell Mead's characterization, President Trump, I think, is fairly considered a Jacksonian. That is, an incoming president with little interest in sustained commitment of U.S. treasure and diplomatic resources to the so-called international system, unless enemies or even allies abroad have directly threatened U.S. domestic well-being. That explains his approaches, for example, to Ukraine, where continued commitment of U.S. military support for the Ukrainian war effort is at best in question, and more likely coming to an end. And it also explains his approach with tough talk and with tariffs toward China. To be sure, it doesn't really explain all of the incoming president's approaches, say to Israel or North Korea, where factors such as domestic policy or maybe even personal vanity respectively play a role. Moreover, the president-elect's general orientation create dilemmas, such as how to confront China without tending carefully to alliance relationships in South and East Asia and Oceania, that is, India, Japan, and Australia. But what the president-elect's general approach to the world does mean is that refugee and other migration issues, as well as international humanitarian issues, will be substantially impacted by this election. And in fact, the president-elect has said as much in very explicit terms. And many, if not most analysts, have argued that he is, to a large extent, channeling as well as stoking popular sentiments. This despite the trivial percentage of U.S. government monies devoted to humanitarian programs, and despite the benefits that refugees bring to communities like Minnesota that have experienced serious labor shortages, the American public is wary at best of these commitments. So what does all this mean? Let's get down to brass tacks. On international refugee and humanitarian assistance, the United States is the largest by far provider of this form of humanitarian aid around the world, at some $10 billion or more per year. In the first Trump administration in 2017, when the number was more like $9 billion, the then president proposed cutting such aid by a third, but was not successful due to bipartisan support for such aid, including support from Republican members of the Senate and House. In 2024, or 2025, I guess, I expect the proposed cuts will be at least 50% and probably more, and that the speed bumps in the former Senate within the Republican Party will largely disappear. Another critical issue is the U.S. refugee admissions program, which, since enactment of the Refugee Act in 1980, has brought to the United States nearly 4 million individuals fleeing persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. The President-elect has indicated, given his concerns about this program, that the program will be suspended, and I expect this to occur on day one, and the President has pretty much the full authority to do it. The President-elect is also likely to take aim at what is known as the parole authority of the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. This is a discretionary authority, again, that my students have heard too much about, that the Biden administration has most recently used to secure the entry of many tens of thousands of Ukrainians and Afghans, as well as Nicaraguans, Haitians, Cubans, and Venezuelans, all who could be deemed in one way or another fleers of necessity, to use a term coined by migration expert Alex Lanikoff. I expect that those programs will largely be shuttered, and there will be legislation to limit that authority. Moreover, current parolees in the United States may see their status revoked, and unless those people have made application, as many have, to other forms of relief, their situation will become precarious. There are other programs that are at risk of being terminated, in which the status of hundreds of thousands of individuals in the United States will be at risk or will be in question. For example, individuals in the United States from more than 10 countries that have experienced man-made or natural disasters are benefiting from a program called Temporary Protected Status. And hundreds of thousands of persons are benefiting from President Obama's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. Here again, if these programs are ended, and if those who are affected have not sought other status, this situation will become very precarious. And that though we don't have specifics, it is clear that Senior Presidential Advisor Stephen Miller has ambitious plans for large-scale deportation of those who are in the United States without authorization. Finally, it goes without saying that access to asylum at the U.S. southern border will be severely restricted, and more severely than current restrictions, because current restrictions have coexisted with generous entry through parole programs for tens of thousands of individuals from the region, and current programs have utilized the so-called CBP mobile app that has enabled applicants to make appointments for asylum consideration at U.S. ports of entry. So in closing, however, I'll suggest that the future is nonetheless uncertain, and we should be reminded that the approaches that the President-elect is advancing do echo voices of other public figures throughout U.S. history who have had substantial degrees of public support. Moreover, there are several obstacles the new administration will confront, either immediately or over time. First, many of the administration's planned actions will face serious legal challenges that may thwart some of these objectives. Second, the countries that will be impacted by large-scale returns, and Mexico in particular, are not without any influence, and we may see U.S. programs evolve. Third, many informed analysts have argued that the administration's ambitions, if realized, one of whom is probably right next to me, whose ambitions, if realized, will have significant and negative economic consequences for communities around the country. And this will not go unnoticed. And finally, members of Congress, the advocacy community, and civil society more broadly, including important sectors of the American public, will push back on some of these measures, on all of these measures, some of these people may be inspired to do so by the personal situation of their friends and their neighbors. So while we can predict some of what will be coming, we don't really know, we never know. But in this case, we don't really know what the future will bring, other than to say, frankly, I think that each of us can have some impact on how this story evolves.
Thank you very much, Eric. Next, I want to turn to Christina Ewig. Christina, you're going to address gender policies in the second administration.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Ryan, and thanks to Dean Bochwe for bringing us together for this conversation. Yeah, my research, as you noted, Ryan, in your introduction, is focused on actually it's focused on Latin America, internationally focused. But through my teaching and my directorship of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy, I track a lot of policy in the U.S. context. So my remarks are going to try to bridge those two, but from what we know so far, we know a lot more about what's going to happen in the United States with regard to gender policy. And I'm going to make my educated guesses based upon three things: campaign promises, cabinet picks, and Project 225, which on the campaign trail, President Trump said would not be a blueprint for his administration, as his challengers said it would be. Yet we do see some of the architects of that document being nominated for key positions, such as Russell Vought for the Office of Management and Budget. All right, I'm going to start, and a lot of this many of you probably know if you read the news, but maybe I can provide a overarching summary that'll bring it together synthetically for you. CSPG is going to have a panel, I believe next week, that's titled something like Cabinet Picks Tell Us a Lot About an Administration Coming in. And when we think about gender policy, there are so far 3 cabinet picks that are quite interesting. Donald Trump nominated former House Representative Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, as surely you remember, and a media firestorm about his centrality in sex trafficking and sex with a minor forced him to withdraw his nomination. We still have, though it's sort of hanging by a thread at this point, the nomination of Pete Hegseth to lead the Department of Defense. He's accused of sexual assault in 2017. And more recently, revelations of harassment of women in 2 nonprofit organizations that he ran. And then we have Linda McMahon, nominated to lead the Department of Education, named in a lawsuit that alleges that she and her husband created a work culture at the World Wrestling Entertainment, the WWE, that was conducive to sexual abuse. So if cabinet picks set the tone for an administration, there you have 3 key positions that set a tone. One of disregard for women, and particularly women's right to be free of sexual and other forms of violence. So now let me dig into some of the policies we might be able to expect. I'm going to look at briefly reproductive rights, then transgender rights, military service, and workplace equality. So of course it was due to Donald Trump's Supreme Court nominations in his first term as president that we saw Roe v. Wade overturned with the Dobbs decision. He also rolled back the requirement in the Affordable Care Act for that health insurance cover contraception. The results of rolling back Dobbs, although it is recent, are already devastating. For example, in Texas, there's been a 56% rise in pregnancy-related deaths. We already knew that in those states prior to overturning Dobbs, those states with greater restrictions on abortion see much higher rates of maternal mortality. We have a crisis of maternal mortality already in the United States when we compare it to other advanced industrialized countries. Especially for Black women in the United States, maternal mortality rates are more like those of developing countries. So how could things possibly get worse? Well, One way they could get worse, and we've already seen attempts at this, is to push the administration to institute the dormant 1873 Comstock Act, which basically prohibits the mailing of obscene materials. And conservative groups and Project 225 advocate that mailing of abortion medication be viewed as obscene, and thus we could see access to abortion further reduced, because today the biggest source and method of abortion is medical abortion, not necessarily surgical abortion. Second, we could see further restriction of abortion medication through pressure on the FDA. We've already seen a lawsuit in which the Biden administration has defended mifepristone as a form of abortifacient. We could see similar lawsuits under a Trump administration, but an FDA that we know will likely be led by Dr. Marty Makary, who is conservative and anti-abortion in his views. We could see a national abortion plan, though national abortion ban, though President Trump had said he would not forward that, but with all that could come through the legislature to his desk, however, right? Thinking globally, every single Republican president since Ronald Reagan has instituted something that's called the Mexico City policy. It's also called the Global Gag Rule, and that basically says that any organization that receives U.S. funding must not even talk about abortion. When I've done my research in Latin America under Republican administrations, and often it has been engaging with reproductive health organizations in Latin America, it's very difficult to do interviews on that because people will not speak about it if they receive that funding. That is why it's called a gag rule. And that has serious implications for the kind of information they can give to women in those countries about abortion care. Beyond abortion, threats to Medicare and Medicaid can affect reproductive health more broadly, right? So issues of maternal mortality, like I mentioned, and broader reproductive health issues. Let me move to trans issues. President Trump declared in August on the campaign trail that on day one, I will sign an executive order instructing every federal agency to cease the promotion of sex or gender transition at any age. They are not going to do it anymore. Transgender rights were central to this campaign. They became really a cudgel between the two parties that was used by the Republicans, right, to show that the Biden-Harris administration was somehow very, very radical. How could he carry out this pledge? Two big ways are in education policy and another in health policy. He could move to exclude transgender individuals from Title IX protections. Title IX is the federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in educational programs and activities. It is the law that, for example, says faculty cannot engage in sexual harassment. It is the law that says that women and girls should have equal rights to sports. Under Democratic interpretations, under Obama, and then under the Biden administration, transgender students have been included in that as under the definition of sex, right? We saw that reverse in the previous Trump administration, and we're likely to see very clearly that reverse under this administration as well, given the campaign rhetoric, and also given what is outlined in Project 225. Trump has also promised to use the Education Department's Office of Civil Rights to threaten school districts with a loss of federal funding if they don't comply with a more conservative interpretation of sex, a binary version of sex. So this is all something that's done through executive action. We've seen the Biden administration have a broader view of a broader interpretation of this. It will go more narrow. That will impact funding. We also have probably seen in the news the pledge by on the campaign trail to eliminate the Department of Education. It's not clear that that will happen. It'll be very difficult for that to happen, but that is the body that oversees Title IX. So if you get rid of the Department of Education, it would be hard to actually enforce Title IX under any kind of interpretation of it. Moving to healthcare and trans rights, at least 26 states have adopted laws restricting or banning gender-affirming medical care. If you're watching the news last 2 days, there's an important Supreme Court case that's been started, oral arguments yesterday in Tennessee, which has sought to ban hormone therapy for minors. That's one arena where we see, the courts and the states where we see restrictions emerging on transgender health care. Trump has promised on the campaign trail that any doctor or hospital providing gender-affirming care should be barred from Medicaid and Medicare. He has also promised to stop covering hormone therapy paid for by Medicare and Medicaid. So either of those routes could be routes in which there's reduced access to hormone therapy because it would no longer be covered under those federal programs. And very often when we have those federal programs enacted, private insurance follows suit. So globally, thinking about this LGBTQ rights, the Biden administration's State Department currently has a policy that supports LGBTQ rights and its relationships with other states. With the pick of Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, potentially, if he is confirmed, Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, does not have a very strong track record in the U.S. of supporting LGBTQ rights. So I would think that that kind of soft diplomacy would be likely to disappear. Women in the military, I'll say I lost track of my time. I'm not sure where I'm at. But I mentioned Pete Hegseth. Besides his tattoos that indicate white nationalism, we also, and the rape allegations, he specifically says that women should not serve in the military. Women in the U.S. have served in the military since 2013 and have served alongside men in combat roles. It would be a radical change to reverse course on that policy. Transgender individuals in the military under the previous Trump administration were prohibited from serving in the military. That was reversed by the Biden administration. I think we're likely to see changes in military policy with regard to more restrictive transgender participation and benefits. And finally, I'll speak a little bit to workplace equality. In the previous Trump administration, his administration rolled back federal policies that required companies to report their gender and racial pay gaps. I didn't see anything in the campaign or in recent picks to give us a good idea where he would go, but that he has publicly said that he doesn't see a need for paying attention to the gender pay gap in some of his remarks. I think in terms of LGBTQ individuals, there's perhaps even greater concern. Part of Project 225 advocates using religious exemptions as a way to get around the 2020 Supreme Court decisions that basically put LGBTQ individuals as a protected class in our civil rights law. And that would then impact them and their rights in the workplace. So unlike when I was sitting on this panel in 2016, where I was able to say there are some perhaps positives in the Trump administration, it was very hard for me to find evidence of potential roads towards greater gender equality with the incoming administration.
Thank you, Christina, for your comments. We're going to turn next to our third panelist, Tricia Olson. Tricia, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. Just thank you to Dean Bochwe for creating this space, for Ryan, my fellow panelists, and for everyone who's joining us for this important conversation today. So in 10 minutes, I can't be comprehensive, but certainly hope to spur further conversation and thinking. It's interesting hearing the other panelists, we didn't coordinate on how we would structure our talks, but they're not dissimilar. I feel like mine's a bit of a blend of the two in terms of approach, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Trump's record, similarly, thinking we actually know what he did during his last administration. And then I want to talk a little bit about environmental policy and human rights policy with an eye toward putting them in a broader context that I hope might motivate action. I guess I'm speaking from a perspective of someone who cares deeply about human rights, and so I think that's kind of the thread with which I'm hoping to talk about this in a way that allows us to think about how we move forward, knowing what's ahead. So as I'm talking along that line, I encourage you to consider two ideas. One is to contemplate the idea that with uncertainty comes opportunity, and we are facing quite a bit of uncertainty. And the second, to quote Shakespeare's The Tempest, is misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows, meaning we may need to consider working with unlikely allies as we navigate the next 4 years and beyond. So Trump's record. Unlike 2016, we now have a record about what Trump did with regards to human rights broadly, and what his administration might do this time to reduce the protection of rights within the United States, but also his efforts to weaken international institutions that advocate for and support human rights norms globally. So this is 2017. He signed an executive order banning people from 6 Muslim-majority countries from entering the US and drastically cut back refugee admissions, as we heard. He sought a review on Dodd-Frank, Wall Street reform, and the Consumer Protection Act, which was viewed as an opening attack on consumer protection laws. The Justice Department's Civil Rights Division and Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights jointly rescinded the Title IX guidance, clarifying protections under the law for transgender students. Attorney General Sessions withdrew an earlier Justice Department memo that set a goal of reducing and ultimately ending the department's use of private prisons. And House Republicans released a proposal to replace the Affordable Care Act with a law that would end the Medicaid program as we know it and defund Planned Parenthood. That was just in the first 8 weeks. So over the course of his presidency, as we know, he expanded executive power, sought to quell protest and dissent, limited the rights to assembly and freedom of speech, implemented racist policies, rolled back LGBTQ protections, shut the door on refugees and immigrants, and undermined indigenous rights. Globally, Trump and his administration largely abandoned international institutions that facilitate international cooperation and have really provided the bedrock of our international human rights regime since World War II. In June of 2018, his administration withdrew the US from the world's most important human rights body, the Human Rights Council. In May of 2019, his administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. And in 2019, the US withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. In 2020, the Trump administration levied sanctions against officials of the International Criminal Court, the world's only international court that can hold individuals accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So these are serious attacks on human rights, and I want to underscore the severity of what was done during his administration and the real harm that these policies caused. However, I want to put some of these in context and other policy initiatives about environmental protections and human rights, and I want to do so for two reasons. First, to really highlight that there's more nuance to many of these issues broadly, not just within the Trump administration, than we may realize. I often find that history is more complex, messy, and full of compromise than we often admit, and I hope, anyway, that this should give us some hope. There's hope in uncertainty and opportunity in uncertainty. And the second reason that I want to highlight this is that there's more work to be done. There's interesting work, there's creative work, there's innovative work. And as I said earlier, I think there may be a need to make new alliances and to approach these issues in ways that we have yet to do. I also want to note that that work involves celebrating the small wins when they come, but also realizing that it doesn't stop. If we've learned anything, we understand that the achievements that may have been made in any of these areas aren't secured forever, right? They're open to criticism and backlash and the like. So with regard to the environment, in his most recent campaign, Trump promised to reduce the cost of energy and increase drilling. Lots of drill, baby, drill. And it's important to note that the U.S.'s reliance on oil isn't and won't be because of Trump. So according to the public broadcasting station in a recent report, production actually hit record highs under Biden, largely due to changes in the global oil market related to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the U.S. is and has for years been the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, doing so despite restrictions on leasing and oil and gas extraction on federal lands. And so interestingly, I was reading some industry reports in preparation for today, and the oil industry isn't so excited about drill, baby, drill. Increased supply may mean lower costs for consumers, but it also means less revenue. Moreover, the oil industry is actually estimating that the global oil market will be in surplus next year, and weaker prices would result in lower growth. Now, I'm not saying environmental groups will suddenly align with the oil industry, but it's important to know, and I think in these times, look for the fissures or opposition that exist within his flanks, and that there may be opportunity there. Another claim is that he'll defeat inflation by terminating the Inflation Reduction Act, which he calls the Green New Deal. And I hesitated, I typed this out and then thought maybe I should delete it, but he's not wrong there. Most analyses, even Biden, admit that the Inflation Reduction Act wasn't really designed to reduce inflation. However, various estimates claim that about 70 to 80% of the Inflation Reduction Act's benefits have actually gone to districts that have Republican representation in Congress or voted for President Trump in this election. And so eliminating this signature climate bill could receive significant pushback from Republican constituents and leaders themselves. Likewise, Trump has stated that now, quote, now they want to give you all electric cars. First day in office, I'll be ending all of that. I haven't received mine, so I'm not sure where my electric car is. But electric vehicle sales hit a record high during the third quarter, even though automakers, slowed production. But the beneficiaries of the tax credits that actually are closely related to battery manufacturers, and those manufacturers are in red states like Georgia, North Carolina, and they're the result of this type of government investment. So eliminating tax credit for electric vehicles could also be a challenge for President Trump. Similarly, there are possible alliances for existing policies that will need to be leveraged. Moreover, one wonders what Elon Musk feels about Trump's claim to, quote, end electric cars. So the takeaway here, and these are small examples, especially when we think about the vast challenges that we face with regards to environmental protection, are just that there is opposition within these flanks. And it's not going to be, some of the rhetoric, I think, though terrifying, I think we also have to look for those opportunities where there may be sort of unlikely alliances in these spaces, knowing that it's a much more complicated picture than just rolling everything back. I wanted to turn to international human rights next. And while I want to acknowledge that the United States has made many meaningful and important contributions to human rights around the world, some of which were initiated here in Minnesota, and many of which have been heavily supported by folks at the University of Minnesota, this country has also undermined and denied human rights overseas and at home. And so, somewhat like our country's record on the environment or oil, I was joking with somebody earlier, it's not like we were an A student in this space before Trump. So the US is one of 5 countries in the world that has not ratified CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The US has been consistently critical of the International Criminal Court, and 166 of 193 member states of the UN have either abolished the death penalty or do not use it. But in 2023, our country executed 24 people through lethal injection. So the takeaway here, and I'm not going to sort of get into all of the policies that I think we may see coming toward us, but I want to highlight that history is always more complicated than the narratives we tell or retell. And do I have a few minutes still, Ryan?
Why don't you take one or two? Yep.
Okay. So just very briefly, one of my favorite examples recently, and I appreciate your willingness, or I guess you're a captive audience, so you have to come with me on a bit of a historical tale here. But one of my favorite examples recently is of the Magna Carta. So the University of Minnesota actually has one of, it's from the gosh, 18, I'm not even going to try. It's from the 1500s, the version we have today. But this is a document that was created in 1215 and is still celebrated today as the foundation of the rule of law. This is a very big deal. And the Magna Carta aimed to broker peace between King John of England and his barons. And so the story goes that King John was the worst. He imposed taxes for his barons to pay for foreign wars. They refused to pay, and he punished them or seized their land. So having quite enough, the barons take London, and they basically have King John sign the Magna Carta, in which he basically agrees that he is not above the law. And so it is this document that has been repeated in one form or another in English law, in the United States Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, among others. Now, this is usually where the story ends. In fact, we just had a big celebration of the 800th year, right, of the Magna Carta. But when I was digging into it, there are two surprising and important additions. First, the Magna Carta, which outlined powerful ideas that have persisted for 800 years, was actually only in effect for 10 weeks. 10 weeks, that was it, 10 little weeks. In August of 2015, the Pope declared that King John signed it under distress and had it annulled. Second, that annulment of the Magna Carta effectively prompted a civil war, the First Barons' War, the same year it was issued. So no one tells those parts of the story. And I think what's happening now, and I appreciate you coming on that little journey with me, is that we're living through the challenging moments that often aren't told, right? So I think it's important to kind of keep this history in perspective and embrace what I call the marginal successes. I'm sure the barons felt great when they got the king to sign that, right? And then it was reversed. And so I think when you're sort of thinking about what's next or how to move forward, I hope that we just can keep the bigger picture in mind, I think, as we face, the next 4 years and beyond. So just to end there, as I think about what's coming and even the backsliding that we've faced already, I'm grateful that we have a human rights system, though woefully imperfect, upon which to call in these moments.
Thank you very much, Tricia. An unexpected benefit of the Magna Carta primer for me. So what's going to happen next? I appreciate all of those remarks. I would like to take prerogative of the moderator and ask some directed questions to the panelists. Keep your questions coming. It looks like we have a lot, so you've clearly figured out how to use the technology. I appreciate that very much. And we will turn to those in a moment and get through as many of them as we can. But I want to start with a round of questions for our panelists. And the first one I'm going to pose to Eric, but it occurs to me in reading it and thinking about it, I'd like to also hear your perspectives, Christina and Tricia, on this question. The question is this: both on national security policy and the case of the border, as you've described, Eric, President-elect Trump has some latitude, and he's expressed some significant ideas about what he wants to achieve. However, it's also true that it wasn't just President Trump who was elected. There's Congress, right? And now Republicans hold slim majorities in both houses, although there is still a filibuster that will be difficult for Republican senators to get over. The question is this: given the authority that President-elect Trump will have when he takes office, but also the power of Congress, how's this going to shake out? How much latitude does President Trump really have?
Well, as a practical matter, he's got a lot. As I went through in my remarks, there are, in the area of refugee admissions, his authority is pretty plenary. I mean, it is the president who decides how many refugees we're going to take in every year. On the other major way in which the United States has brought fleers of necessity into the United States, the parole authority, that resides wholly within the executive branch. And in fact, the sentiment from Congress on the parole authority is not, we're going to force the president to make more extensive use of it, but rather it's been dramatically overused by the administration. And so if there is any legislation on parole, it's going to be to restrict that authority more significantly. And so I don't see an avenue there. I think, I also think that, you know, right now, again, I'll keep referring to my students because I see so many of them. We heard yesterday from an advocate who had just left I just remembered it was not on the record, so just left a progressive senator who basically said, you know, if we have to give up, who basically was very negative on the prospect of the Congress playing a significant and substantial role. And so I think the other factors, so I'm not relying on Congress to do a lot, unless, of course, the one area I could see Congress doing a lot is if the president comes forward with additional measures beyond what I've laid out in my talk, then I think the Senate could play an important role, because then you will have enough Democrats and maybe some Republicans to prevent a filibuster-proof majority. But in circumstances like that, I think we're going to see the extent to which the president is prepared to try to overcome these legislative norms. I think the president, whether he can articulate it, I think the president has I realize I'm talking too long. He has a position about democracy, which is I won, so I get to make these. You know, I have a mandate, and that may include efforts to challenge the filibuster in circumstances where it doesn't achieve his objectives. His position is it's not one that I agree with, but it's a defensible position, you know, but that's a circumstance in which I could see an effort. But I think the other examples I gave in my talk are probably more significant in terms of speed bumps.
Christina, Tricia, do you have perspectives on that question, the role of Congress and how President Trump will interact with them on the issues that you've described?
Sure, I've got some perspectives on that. I think building on Eric's last comment in terms of the idea of having a mandate, we've seen, for example, Trump suggesting that he should be able to make nominations during congressional recess. So trying to find ways in which to avoid the Senate and Congress is certainly on his mind. Of the possible policy changes that I outlined, many of them do fall within just executive decision-making. So, for example, interpretation of Title IX and whether or not transgender is considered protected under Title IX is simply an executive decision. So that will easily change. But then other pieces, for example, a national abortion ban would have to go through the Congress and the Senate, very unlikely to pass that filibuster test. But the FDA could decide not to defend a case against another future case against mifepristone, right? So it really depends upon the level, but there's a lot that happens within those key appointments, within the bureaucracy that affect all the areas that I've talked about. The decisions by the military, very internal. So a lot can happen simply by executive order.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I mean, I would agree that, you know, I feel like I sort of approach the human rights perspective as thinking about it more as a movement. And so even as folks were talking, I was thinking about the ways in which, you know, during his previous administration, it's not just the norms and discourse that's used, it's also, you know, administrative tools, executive actions, judicial battles, it's, you know, sort of all of the above, in addition to a strong legislative agenda. I guess I will say that I believe there is quite a bit of agency with or without Congress. I mean, I don't see a lot of speed bumps there. I was just at the UN Business and Human Rights Forum in Geneva a couple of weeks ago, and there's tremendous concern there about another Trump administration and what that means for international institutions. And, you know, for most of that participation, he can sort of remove, you know, the role. Certainly funding is an issue, in addition to supporting international human rights norms and what the United States says abroad. You know, I had to sort of wonder, and I haven't actually seen anything written on this, but just I think we'll see more kind of authoritarian tendencies around the globe as we did during his last administration. And certainly that can, you know, that is happening far outside of Congress's walls.
Thank you for those insights. Christine, I want to come back to you. There's a fair amount of pessimism on the stage, but I wonder if you could speak to, for advocates, for others who are concerned about women's rights, about LGBTQ rights, what are the levers that other institutions can pull that may offer speed bumps, to use the metaphor that I think some of you have mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, there are some levers here. One is the Affordable Care Act that specifically outlines transgender as part of sex and as part of a protected aspect. As long as that ACA is in place, that serves as a legal barrier. Of course, there's talk of, you know, rolling it back. There has been for some time, but it's not as strong now as I would say it was in the first election of Trump. So that's one barrier, one speed bump. States have a lot of control over Medicare and Medicaid policy. So it's not with all the rhetoric that we're going to stop funding X, Y, and Z under Medicare or Medicaid. It comes as a block of money to states, and then states create a lot of their own rules. It would be difficult for the federal government to completely control how Medicaid and Medicare funds are used. So that puts really some emphasis on state level policies. That those Supreme Court cases in 2020 that protected LGBTQ and transgender rights, that was the R.G. and G.R. Harris Funeral Homes versus EOC, and the Amy Stevens case. I mean, those are already kind of the backbone of the case that is being heard, was being heard yesterday by the Supreme Court in terms of protecting transgender rights. It remains to be seen how, I think we'll find out in June what that decision is. It's not looking good based upon my reading of how the reactions of the court justices were. But those are still a potential previous court decisions, a potential speed bump along the way. We've already seen those levers in action for reproductive rights. Think, for example, of in this past election, 10 different states had referenda on the ballot to protect abortion rights or to increase the right to abortion. And 7 out of those 10 states, we saw positive votes. In some, you know, the threshold was very, very high to meet it, but still almost made it, for example, in the case of Florida. So decisions like that are other levers, lots of lawsuits. those are other levers. And then I would say really the importance of mobilization and what Tricia was saying in terms of maybe considering a range of potential allies really resonates. Public opinion matters when it comes to the Supreme Court, but you have to mobilize to change opinion and to gather support. And sometimes I would say that we can end up in warring camps even within left or within right, and that doesn't do much for creating the broad coalitions that are really necessary for change and for advancing the kinds of issues that you care about.
Great, thank you. Eric, I'm going to come to one question for you and then one for you, Tricia, and then we're going to turn to the questions from the audience. So Eric, the question is this. So in your remarks, and I don't think you're alone in characterizing the president-elect this way, you've described him in some sense as anti-democratic. And I wonder about that characterization and the potential for that to be seen as demonizing an incoming administration in a way that may prevent discussion, debate, and dialogue that many of us consider fundamental to an academic institution like this university. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I do, and thank you for asking the question that I suggested you ask me.
I'm good for that.
No, the reason I say that is because this is something I've thought about a lot, and I think we got to put it on the table, right? And we know that if you're a responsible, obviously we all exist in an environment of academic freedom. So in this forum, we can say whatever we want. The question is, what are our moral obligations? What are our ethical obligations? And I think, and it can't be that we see where one side is, we see where another side is, and then we figure out how to put ourselves right in the middle, right? That can't be the answer, right? Because that is anti-intellectual, right? And at the same time, how do we recognize in this kind of a forum the fact that half the country, almost half the country, supported President Trump, President-elect Trump, and come to grips with that. And it's made more difficult by the fact that there are people who have supported President-elect Trump with whom dialogue is relatively easy. I don't know who Elliott Abrams voted for, but but we had him in my foreign policy class, and we had a good dialogue. But the challenge in this particular case is it's difficult to dialogue. I have found it difficult to dialogue with folks who are closest to President Trump. So there's a challenge. So what do? I think there's several principles that I'd articulate. One, the obvious one, is civility, right? You're not going to advance the whatever intellectual objectives you have in an environment that is not uncivil. Second, I think when you do analysis, you try to, or description, when you're describing, you try to stay very close to the words that the person you're describing has used. You don't try to misrepresent, and you're even in the strongest position when you're basically parroting what, in this case, the president-elect himself is articulating. The third is, and I've tried to do this, maybe I didn't do it as successfully as I could on the anti-democratic, when you're describing a perspective, try to provide the rationales that the individual has offered. And I did, and maybe I haven't do it well enough, but I do believe that President-elect Trump, is a supporter of what some academics have called illiberal democracy, right? And it basically is a situation where the victor in an election has a stronger mandate than many of our existing norms would suggest should be the case. It is a defensible position. It's one with which I disagree because, in part, because it diminishes the voice of minority, but also we see throughout history, we could rattle off, Christina can do it better than I can because a lot of them in Latin America, presidents who took that view about democracy and illiberal democracy, and that resulted in an easy transformation into authoritarianism and dictatorship, right? And so, but I hope if anyone out there is a supporter of Donald Trump, I think you can make the case that he has a broad mandate, and he shouldn't have to be bothered by some of these constitutional and normative niceties. I mean, it's a defensible position, but if I disagree with it, I think I have to articulate that. And finally, I think most importantly, when you make judgments, when you make firm judgments, you have to keep reminding people that, you're using the scientific method, evidence-based analysis. And if we can't, and if we can't say that is, our lodestar, then then everything we're doing here is a waste of time, right? Because so when you make your arguments, you have to, your analysis has to be evidence-based. And that's the only way I can deal with the question you asked, but because, and the reason I suggested you ask the question is because one or two of our colleagues, have said, this should be a balanced event. And in my classes, we talk about in peacekeeping the distinction between impartiality and neutrality, right? And the analogy, of course, maybe I'm getting too far, getting a little esoteric here, but the analogy is, if you're neutral, you find out where each party stands, and you put yourself right in the middle, right? But that's not a way to arrive at truth. That's a way to arrive in a situation where both parties, maybe will, respect the fact that you're not supporting one or the other, but it's not a way to get to truth. The concept of impartiality, I think, is cleaner, right? Because it means people can be wherever they want to be, but you have to bring these tools to bear in your analysis, if that makes sense. All right, I'm going to get off my soapbox. And,
Thank you for your response there.
yeah.
All right, last question that I have as moderator is for you, Tricia. So there is such a thing as the business and human rights agenda, right? And I wonder if you could just take a moment to explain what that is and what impact do you think Trump will have on it?
Thanks. So, it's kind of a nice follow-up to Eric's point, because I think having studied business and human rights over the last 10 plus years allows for these opportunities where you have people who see the world in very different ways come together to push forward what I would say are greater human rights protections. So I often tell students that today is the day that businesses know the most about human rights, and I still stand by that. I think a decade ago, most business leaders had no idea what that was. But in large part thanks to the advocacy and work from colleagues at the law school here, really, David Weisbrot and Barb Frey and others really pushed forward this business and human rights agenda at the UN. John Ruggie at the Kennedy School was sort of spearheaded the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were approved by the Human Rights Council in 2011. But the business and human rights, I guess that frame, really in my mind, thinking about where Trump and the administration is now, allows for these interesting pairings, I guess I would say. So one thing I'll point just very quickly, one thing I'll say is that the current proposed nominee for the Secretary of Labor is actually a union-friendly pick. So this may have been because of the Teamsters. I don't know if folks followed this, but the Teamsters sort of, president actually spoke at the Republican National Convention, but the bid for the Secretary of Labor is Representative Lori Chavez DeRimmer from Oregon, and she was one of only 3 GOP members who co-sponsored the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. And so here you have somebody who's pro-union, and business leaders are concerned about this, but possibly as a key member of the Trump administration. Some analysts suggest that this is a smart play to co-opt even more of those out of what used to be sort of the traditional Democratic base. But again, I think there's opportunity there. There's uncertainty and certainly some interesting possibilities. The other thing that I'll say is that businesses are already speaking out about a lot of Trump's policies around tariffs, around immigration, and just this notion of the cost that it will bear on consumers and their ability to, effectively deliver the products that many of us expect them to. The third and last thing I'll say is that the other piece of this puzzle with regards to business and human rights is that there is so much happening globally. So with or without Trump, large multinational companies are already preparing for legislation that's coming down the pike in Europe. So the European Union is in the process of sort of clarifying how to implement this law, but it's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or the CSDDD. And that basically means that companies of certain sizes and companies that do a certain amount of business within Europe are actually required to do human rights due diligence for themselves and their tier one suppliers. So that is going to have a tremendous effect on global business, with or without the Trump administration. And so I think, again, if there's opportunity for local organizations to realize these trends that are happening internationally, to really bolster some of the protections that we're concerned about here, I think that's also a really important strategic move.
Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to turn to some of your questions, which are fantastic. There's a bunch of questions about retrenchment of rights, right? And so you've addressed some of this in your remarks, panelists, but I wonder if you could speak to whether you see a likely retrenchment. In particular, one that's named here, Christina, is on marriage equality for all. I would mention also birthright citizenship, and there may be others that are coming to mind. Can you, as panelists, address what you think is at risk here on particular rights that you see maybe facing rollback?
Should I go with marriage equality for all? I guess the short answer is I'm not sure about that. We know that to overturn Roe v. Wade, it took decades of organization, grassroots organization, like key strategic lawsuits, choosing specific judges in order to make its way through for the Dobbs decision. So marriage equality for all, I don't have knowledge of a similar push that would be able to overturn, especially such a recent decision. So that's not to say, it could be that I don't have the knowledge about that, but once you do have a Supreme Court decision like that, it can be overturned. We've seen it, but it does take quite a bit of groundwork and quite a bit of legal work over time. We still have Justice Roberts on the court, who was famous for that decision, for allowing that to happen, but obviously a different tilt in the court. So if that were to make its way through there, we might see a different decision, certainly.
I'll just say a few words in sort of looking globally. I think in one immediate challenge, which already exists, is the furthering of what we call the externalization of asylum. That asylum, to the extent that it means being able to approach a land border and say that I fear persecution and I need to come in, to the extent that it means that, that is imperiled right now. And the implications of that are that people will be returned to persecution or warfare, and that process is already underway. But I think the advent of the Trump administration is going to accelerate it. And I think that the advantage of the Biden administration, which was also part of this problem, was that the Biden administration didn't have a problem with accepting large numbers of fleers of necessity, refugees and others. They just wanted to feel like they could manage it. And that's not, for people who are advocates for refugees, that's not great news, but it's better news than, because here at least you've had an administration, I'm coming from the perspective of a refugee advocate, that was looking at other means to bring, people who needed to flee into the country. That element, we will continue to have externalization of asylum, but the second element of, well, can we figure out how to bring people in? that the Trump administration is not going to be interested in that. So that is a big concern, and that has implications for the behavior of other countries, especially countries in Europe, who have, made deals with countries like Libya about keeping, people within their borders and even interdicting them at sea. The other issue that I'm really concerned about, and this has to do with the laws of war and international human rights law, is that, the international human rights movement, as in advocacy terms, operated always on the principle that if you did reporting and exposing, that we knew there are lots of violations of human rights, but all governments, most governments around the world basically had a sense of shame and were concerned about their reputations. And so the goal of international human rights advocacy was to show the chasm between what a government says it is doing and what is actually happening. The whole process of shame. What I'm concerned about, what I've been concerned about for a long time, is that some governments, seem, and powerful governments, seem to be losing any sense of shame. That the international community's tools for pressing governments in that way are ebbing. And I think my concern is that if the Trump administration demonstrates the kind of disregard that we're concerned about, I think that process is at risk of accelerating, and I think it has serious implications.
Tricia, did you have a policy retrenchment that you're particularly keeping your eye on that you haven't addressed already?
No, I think we can just move on.
Okay. Good. Well, I have another question actually for you. So the courts have declared, and I think this is now, we're seeing the effects of this in many ways, some form of immunity for the president. How does that factor into your thinking about global human rights and the kinds of actions that a presidential administration that's coming into office this January might take?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a heavy one. As if this whole panel hasn't been heavy. But yeah, I mean, it's tremendously concerning. I think especially as somebody who has done a lot of work on transitional justice, there's a tremendous amount of hope and aspiration around holding, so transitional justice are the trials and truth commissions and amnesty mechanisms that we use to sort of transition from authoritarian to non-authoritarian rule, or authoritarian to democratic rule, excuse me. But I think there was tremendous hope and sort of optimism around many of the norms that Eric just mentioned, and what we expect of our leaders. And so to see that the Supreme Court has effectively granted President Trump immunity for acts that are in his official mandate, basically, right, his official duties, is incredibly concerning, because it effectively, maybe we're closer to King James and the barons than I initially thought with my Magna Carta story, because it effectively means that he now feels, and certainly, I guess, legally does, unless there's opportunity to challenge that ruling in some capacity, feels like he has the space to effectively do whatever he wants. And so from a human rights perspective, I think that's incredibly concerning, not just for what that means for people here within the United States, but also what it means for individuals globally. And perhaps that's a good point too. I did want to reiterate that I think some of what I see as hopeful is really folks finding ways to strengthen local institutions. And so, folks finding ways to engage, to think about how to bolster what is happening locally, I think is in some ways kind of the best collective defense we have against pushback for human rights.
Thank you. Toss-up question for whoever wants it. Folks in the audience have identified that many of the proposed cabinet appointees have little, if any, experience in the policy sphere. Does this mean they're going to be ineffective? First person who speaks gets it.
Well, can more than one of us answer it?
Yeah, I guess we can have more than one.
I mean, I guess just really briefly, I would say that again, this is uncertainty in my mind. So on one hand, okay, a couple of thoughts. On one hand, I think you have these people who are, who he hopes to appoint for these very key offices. And behind them is an entire infrastructure that does know what needs to happen, right? So Project 2025, which Christina mentioned on a number of occasions, is incredibly thorough. And so even if that individual doesn't have a lot of experience, I think there is an infrastructure to make sure that things move quickly. So that's sort of the negative perspective. The positive or more optimistic potential perspective is that that also means this person might have ideas or alliances that are distinct from what we might expect people in those positions to hold. And so, possibly there's opportunity for, again, these unlikely alliances in places that could, and I'm not saying that's true for every issue area, but for certain issue areas, it could facilitate some protections or some slowing down of what we might be concerned about.
I love Tricia's constant tack back to thinking positively and possibilities for opportunity. What came to my mind in your question, Ryan, was along with this lack of experience, and I'm curious to hear what Eric has to say, having actually worked in one of these departments. But we have promises, of which there is some protections in place that weren't in place in Trump's first term, but promises to make large changes to the civil service and to expel many civil servants in favor of having appointees. Right? There's some barriers now that exist that weren't there the last time. He wouldn't be able to let go so many civil service members, but to the degree to which that happens, that then allows for that faster track of policies to take place. Because one could think that the head of a particular department can only do so much. It really depends upon the staff that are in place. But if you can easily move that staff out, which is what the plans are, then you have a more nimble trajectory towards the goals that you have in mind. What those goals are with some of these appointees, you have to wonder, because they don't have experience, whether it's the Department of Education or whether it's having been a military veteran but not actually running an organization for the Department of Defense. There's lots of questions about capabilities here, but I think we could see some interesting action. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, Eric.
Well, first of all, I think I agree with Tricia's point about the fact that there are enough people who know what they want to achieve and have a sense of how to achieve it, especially in the White House. I'm thinking of Stephen Miller. That I don't think it's going to be a huge problem. And frankly, I've worked with people who in senior positions who aren't real experts, and they just aren't very effective. They don't have, but we're in a new situation. I've never seen this at the very highest level, and but I still fundamentally, I think I agree with Tricia what you're saying. I don't think the appointment of folks who are incompetent or not qualified for the job at the very highest level, it could create some huge risks and huge dysfunction, but I don't know that it will impact the pace of implementation of what the administration wants to implement. I do think this issue of the civil service is going to be a really important one, because their ambition, the president-elect's ambitions are really pretty significant. And in the last administration, in the last Trump administration, they got into some trouble when they tried to move people around in ways that sort of were inconsistent with civil service protections. So it's a question of how that past experience will impact what they do now. But I guess there's another point I wanted to make, especially as an instructor for students who have such an appetite to making the world a better place and have such an appetite, have such an awareness of the importance of expertise, of real expertise, before you go into positions of responsibility. It's discouraging. It's got to be discouraging when you're going through graduate school, you're spending a lot of money on graduate school, so you can do advanced policy analysis and statistics and global affairs, and you're making yourself an expert, and you see what's happening with who is being appointed in government, and to some extent, I hold Ronald Reagan responsible for this in some respects. When he said, he looked out at the world and said early in his first term, I think, government isn't the solution, government is the problem. And there is this sort of narrative that that government doesn't work, is dysfunctional, and the way to fix it is to eliminate it or just to move it towards irrelevancy, and it just simply ignores the critical role that public institutions have had in the lives of so many Americans. I mean, think about, it depends on what your philosophical orientation is, but think about the transfers of wealth that occurred through Medicare, the Affordable Care Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, which benefited poor people in districts that voted, as you said, for Trump. So that's what worries me. I think, it's insulting and put beyond the fact that it's dysfunctional.
Thank you for those insights. So we're going to have about 5 minutes left in our panel. Eric, I'm going to come back to you.
I'll be quick.
There's a bunch of questions about what the second Trump administration will mean for ongoing global conflicts. I'm going to leave that more generically because there are many underway. Do you have a sense from your time as National Security Council member on what might be likely to happen? Trump had a lot of rhetoric on the campaign trail about what he would do in this situation. How should we interpret this?
The short answer is I don't know. I don't think President Trump is going to have an appetite for, adventurism or nation building, so I think he's going to, I think he's going to try to address the Ukraine situation in ways that are probably not favorable to Ukraine, but pretty quickly. So I'm not certain. I think the two issues that I do think, I don't see an imminent conflict with China, a military conflict. But the two areas of the world that I'm concerned about are the Middle East, because the Palestinian community has a way of reminding the world every many years that they exist, and the issue of the rights of Palestinians has to be part of a solution. And every effort that has been made by various administrations to say, oh, we can solve issues in the Middle East by, increasing, connections between the Gulf countries and Israel, and weakening, Iraq, or whatever. Arguments were made. Every time something like it, we're reminded that we have to deal with the issue of a Middle East peace. And I don't. So I think that issue is going to emerge for Trump in some significant and serious ways. And I think Ukraine. I think he may get a deal, but I'm not confident that the Russians are done in terms of their efforts at aggression, not only in Ukraine but in the region. So, that's what I'm afraid of.
Okay, thank you. We have time for probably a couple more. And this is one that I think many of you could answer, so let me just pose it to the group. How might the Trump administration utilize anti-terrorism statutes to attack and undermine civil society groups that have been critical of U.S. foreign policy? Is that a concern that you have? And if so, is there an avenue you see how it could be implemented?
I mean, I am certainly concerned about that. I was thinking somewhere in my notes I took far too many notes for today, probably. But it's certainly a concern, and in fact, I don't even know if anti-terrorism, like, I'm concerned, I mean, there are many fears, but I'm concerned about increased surveillance in general across a number of issue areas. I'm concerned about his propensity during the last administration and certainly on the campaign trail to use military force on domestic populations. And so I don't, I mean, I think that is one tool of many that it appears he's willing to use. So it's incredibly concerning, yeah.
I think my days of telling the TSA person at the airport that I declined the opportunity to be photographed, those days are probably over, but we'll see. I share, I mean, there's a whole range of laws that impact these sets of issues. In terms of the activities of U.S. organizations operating overseas, in terms of surveillance on Americans. And I think it's fair to say that this administration, again, remembering your former question about how do you phrase things, I think it's fair to say that this administration is going to be less risk tolerant and less less concerned about what a former administration might regard as basic civil liberties that these groups are entitled to have. I mean, and so I think we're going to see some changes. What those are remains to be seen.
Christina, final word for the panel on this question.
Well, I mean, I think the specific question about anti-terrorism, we know that different administrations have defined those groups very differently, so there's a lot of leeway. But I actually want to pick up on the thread of surveillance to come back to reproductive rights. There are bills at the state level in some Republican-leaning states like Florida to actually monitor menstruation. And in Project 25, also to keep track of abortion provision and pregnancy care. And so there's already movement by conservative groups to surveil women very directly, whether those laws pass, whether they don't. But they're out there, and now we have the political individuals in place to potentially carry that out.
Thank you very much for those comments. Before we thank our panelists, let me let you know that next Wednesday we will have our second panel on the second Trump administration, and in that panel we will be discussing democratic governance, presidential power. We'll be discussing bilateral, multilateral relationships for the United States and its influence on potential conflict. I do hope you'll join us again, same time, next Wednesday, the 11th. With that, thank you very much for coming, everyone. Let's give them a round of applause. Get home safely, everybody. It's cold out there.